Thanks, Alex, and thanks to everybody who's attending or looking at this online. I just thought it would be good to have a conversation at this point in time about where things are globally, nationally, and personally with respect to our various economies, but also hear from you. So the talk today or conversation is partly about your personal economics and finances, and happy to talk about those questions and how Maxify Planner can potentially help you resolve them, but also any questions you have about bigger questions, bigger issues globally or nationally. So let me give you the agenda. I'm going to start talking about the global economy, then the national economic outlook, and then our personal economic outlooks. And obviously, they're very different for each of us, but there are some commonalities here and some ways to kind of think about how to handle what for many people is just a terrible situation. For other people, things are just rolling along just fine because they work online and nothing really that much has changed. And then we'll have this group discussion, probably about a half an hour or so into the hour here, and it will go on for basically as long as we have people interested in posing questions. So, and we're taping the whole thing, so again, it will be available for people to listen if they can't stay the whole time. So here's the global economic outlook as I see it. Every economist has their own perspective, but certain facts are real facts. The coronavirus is now seriously stalking the planet. It has been for 9 months or so, but it's 8, 9 months, but it's really taking hold. We've got 56 million people across the planet who have been infected, 1.3 million deaths. Most, not most, but disproportionate share of those located in the US in terms of deaths. The good news, the really good news, is that we have, as of today, 3 proven vaccines that are on their way, and probably more are coming. So they will likely get FDA approval in the coming weeks, and the people will start getting those vaccines beginning in December. What's the growth picture? Well, the average growth between 2010 and 2019 in the last decade has been 3.75% real. So this is a real growth rate. It's subtracting from any inflation that has arisen. So output around the world has risen by almost 4% a year, and that's very substantial. That's a very good story for the world. Although in many parts of the world, population is growing even more rapidly. So we have to really think about per capita GDP, and that's a different story. That it's not growing as rapidly for sure. Indeed, you would find this really surprising to learn if you don't know it already. But the United Nations is projecting an increase in the global population from about 7.6 billion now to about 11.4 billion. So we're going to be adding something like 2.5 Chinas through the end of this century in terms of the world population. Just think about having 2.5 more Chinas in the world today, and you get a sense of how fast and rapidly the population of the world is growing. And much of that population growth is going to occur not in China, which is scheduled to lose about 400 million people, more than the entire US population, because they're aging and they're not having that many kids. The US population is projected to rise by about 120 million, but roughly the population of Japan through the course of the century. But then the real increase in population is going to be situated in sub-Saharan Africa and the Middle East and India. So these are the areas that are really growing quite dramatically in terms of population totals, according to the UN. Now, the projected growth for 2020 is down to negative 3%. That's reflecting, obviously, the pandemic. But there's a major rebound that's being projected at 5.8%. Whether this will actually happen, I think, depends on how fast we can get the world vaccinated, or how fast we can get testing at at a high capacity, which is possible, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So, what do we see in the developed world? We see, well, the U.S., the U.K., and the EU are all experiencing a second or third wave, depending on how you define it. The UK and the EU are now fully or partially locked down. The US is going to likely see winter lockdowns in certain parts because the hospitals are reaching capacity. And we're already seeing in certain states pauses and curfews and schools being shut down. In Rhode Island, where I'm living, I live in Providence, and as I mentioned in prior webinars, I commute to Boston University to teach. But the governor has announced a pause starting right after Thanksgiving for about 2 weeks, and that won't be exactly a lockdown, but it will be close. Contagions also really taken off in India, South America, Middle East, and Russia. Surprisingly, not so much in Africa, particularly South Africa is an exception, but the rest of Africa is doing pretty well, and that may have to do with the blood type of Africans, which tends to be more type O than the other types, and that apparently has some role in keeping you from getting this disease or getting sick from it. There's huge uncertainty about the global outlook. We have the question of how long it's going to take to vaccinate 7.6 billion people around the globe. Of course, we don't have to vaccinate everybody for the virus to go away, for the reproduction rate to go below 1, and basically for us to be safe. Not everybody's vaccinated against smallpox in the world. Not everybody's vaccinated against polio. So we don't need everybody to comply and get the vaccine to get this plague under control. But because it's going to take quite a while, there's likely to be significant travel restrictions for many years, because we won't know who's coming from where, whether they've been vaccinated. So countries may be reluctant to take in tourists from different countries, or certainly workers from different countries. Asia has been doing remarkably well in terms of handling this virus. We have like 260,000 deaths. China has like 3 million deaths in total. Taiwan has essentially no deaths. South Korea, same thing. Japan. So they're really virus free because they've done a fantastic job containing this virus, and we haven't. And so their economies are growing. It's going to be very difficult to restore the international trading system, not just because of what's happened with the virus, but we've had a trade war that's actually gotten worse. Even in the last couple of days, there's been dramatic increases in trade barriers that the U.S. is imposing on China. I think we just banned doing business with something like 86 high-tech Chinese companies, and they're going to retaliate. So in the meantime, China just signed a trade deal with 14 countries covering in Asia, covering a third of the world population. This includes Japan and New Zealand, I believe Australia, and we're out of the loop. So this could spell a major turning point in the world economic order, where the U.S. has a capacity to be the economic hegemon, the big shot, calling the world economic shots. We may see us slipping in that dimension and moving into second or third place. We now have about 15% of world GDP. Given the demographics and given the catch-up productivity growth in many of these other parts of the world, we could have a 10% share of the world GDP by 2100, not 15%. So, and at the same time, China might have potentially a quarter of the world GDP. So we will be, like, if you take Germany and France together, they probably have about, maybe Germany, France, and Italy, they have about 10% of world GDP. We'll be like them compared to uh, the world, the rest of the world at the end of the century if things turn out as projected. Now, there is a bright spot to this kind of somewhat gloomy global outlook, although, again, the vaccine coming on is a great a great positive factor. But another bright spot is a rapid paper strip tests where you can basically put a swab in your nose, stick it in some liquid, stick it in a little plastic cassette, and the uh, the piece of paper inside that cassette has two stripes, and if both stripes light up, you are positive. If one lights up, you're negative, and then you can take a picture of the negative result of your negative strip test result, send it to school to go to school, or send a picture of your child's test so that they can safely get back into school or go to that for that day, and send it to your employer so you can go to work, send it to a restaurant to get a reservation. So this becomes a passport, and these things can be mass produced. It's just a matter of getting the FDA to approve these for over-the-counter at-home use, and having the government provide them via the mail, send us a year's supply so that we can all take these tests every day. And that, even independent of vaccines, can get the uh, transmission rate of this virus down below 1 and have the virus basically contained and killed within a month if the people that are positive, uh, by and large, act responsibly and self-quarantine. Even if only 70% behave appropriately, we'll still get that R0 value, which is what the epidemiologists use or refer to, below 1, and will be pretty much home free. So there is the potential for these rapid tests because they exist. I have some in my house because I've been interacting with some of the CEOs of companies making these, and they work uh, they work as advertised, and they just have to be approved by the government. And these companies are now taking steps to try and get them approved, so to do the testing of the test. So that should be coming on. What about some some kind of macroeconomic factors that we're facing? Well, the world debt to GDP ratio is now 331%. So we have basically uh, a lot of debt. Okay, this is both uh, company debt and government debt. It's a big share of world GDP. So the world's got a lot of outstanding debt, which means whenever you have country governments or companies that are highly indebted, you have the potential for bankruptcy, and that needs to be borne in mind in thinking about that type of number. The world debt is supposed to rise by over 15 trillion. Our GDP is about 21 trillion, so we're talking about the world adding almost, let's say 2/3 of a U.S. year's GDP to the stock of debt. Our deficit is projected 3.3 trillion, 16% of U.S. GDP. I think that might be the record. Maybe it was certainly a post-war record by miles. I don't know whether we borrowed that share of GDP during World War II. We might well have done so, but anyway, huge increase in indebtedness. The states have also borrowed about 2% of U.S. GDP. And what does all this borrowing mean? Well, it means that the bill for COVID-19 is largely being left to our children. And part of what we're doing, in addition to borrowing money to pay for the bills, is to print money to pay for our bills. The U.S.-based money supply, it's called the monetary base. It's increased by 53% since January. That's an enormous increase. So for the UK, it's about 39%. The EU, it's 47%. Japan, it's 38%. Huge amount of money printing. Now, what's going on with all this money that's being printed? Well, the central banks like the Federal Reserve or the Bank of England or the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, they're printing this money and they're saying, well, look, this is not inflationary because what we're doing is we're printing this money and we're going to go buy financial assets. So we're going to go buy, let's say, a treasury bond from the U.S. government, or we'll buy a bond from some company like might be a company that's issued car loans, or we'll even buy an IOU from students who are trying to borrow money, or we'll buy mortgages. And so we're buying financial assets, and if the financial assets pay back, so we lend, let's say figuratively, I'm lending out, I'm the Federal Reserve Bank, and I lend Alex the money to go to college. And if he pays me back, I mean, I give him the dollar bills. If he pays me back, I get the dollar bills back. And there's been no permanent change in the supply of money. The green piece of paper go out to Alex, and the green piece of paper come back from Alex back to me. And it's a wash. And this is what the central banks are claiming, that their policy is not inflationary because they're buying IOUs, financial assets. They're not just printing money to pay for their government's lunch or to build a bridge or something. They're going to get money back. It's not in order to make a free transfer payment. They're not just printing money and putting it into helicopters and dropping it on our heads. But the big question here is whether these banks will actually pay back. You know, and figuratively, if Alex could not repay me because he goes to school and then he can't get a job that affords him enough of the pay to pay me back, then now we have a permanent increase in the money supply because I never get those green piece of paper back. And the same thing with all the different companies that have borrowed money over this period. When we're talking about a 53% increase in the base money supply, we're talking in the trillions of dollars of money creation, and that really may translate into a permanent increase in greenbacks in the U.S., which means ultimately an increase in inflation. More money chasing a declining supply of goods, which is what we have, less output, certainly this year, means we're going to have inflation. That is something that people haven't seen for a long time, but I'm old enough to remember 10% or so inflation rates in the 70s, and we know plenty of countries around the world have decided that they could print money and have no problem with inflation and ended up with hyperinflation. Think about Russia in the late 90s. They had a hyperinflation like 100% a year. Venezuela's had a hyperinflation. We had 22 hyperinflations in the last century. Israel had a hyperinflation. The biggest, the mother of all inflations, I think, was Hungary post-World War II, I believe. Germany in the 20s, where people were being paid in real barrelfuls of money at lunchtime, and they had to go spend it immediately. By the end of the day, the whole wheelbarrowful of money was worthless because prices were rising exponentially. So I'm not saying that's happening today or going to happen for a couple of years, but unless we get things under control and can get these companies to pay back, we're going to have a permanent increase in the supply of money out there, and that leaves us with a potential for very high inflation. And certainly Milton Friedman, if any of you remember him, was a very major inflation hawk. We're very much worried about the supply of money leading to inflation. He's certainly rolling in his grave today, thinking about what we're doing in terms of monetary policy. So that's a concern. I'm not saying for sure things may be different. Maybe the U.S. is, people have so much faith in the dollar that there's basically a huge unlimited demand for dollars. We can print as much as we want without having to worry about inflation. A lot of people believe that, and we're certainly testing that proposition these days. Here's a picture just of coronavirus deaths. You can see the ups and downs have to do with the reporting. I think on the weekends we're not getting accurate reports about the deaths until a couple days later, but you can see that the deaths are coming back up from where they were around February, March, and April. So COVID spreading faster and broader than ever. Again, 260,000 plus dead Americans, 12 million known cases. There probably are about 120 million actual cases, because I think 9 out of 10 people, according to the CDC, Center for Disease Control, are never getting tested. So they get COVID, They may be asymptomatic. A lot of people are, especially if you're young, and they just never get tested. So we have no idea that they're actually, but that's what the CDC is saying, that about 9 out of 10 get the disease and never have a PCR test. So maybe we have 120 million people that have actually been infected. Well, from the perspective of herd immunity, that's a good thing, because if they're infected already and survived it and they cannot get reinfected, that means that they can't be transmitters of this epidemic. But the U.S. population is 330 million, so if only 120 million actually have been infected, we are miles away from herd immunity. We already have close to 200,000 cases per day, which is a huge increase from where it was over the summer, and we're closing on about 2,000 deaths per day. So this is very scary times, and Americans are not, in general, taking the precautions they need to help protect themselves and to help protect others, in terms of the best thing, which is staying away from people and wearing a mask if you're around people and staying your distance. Things are just not, that's just not happening. And that's why we have the hospitals close to being overrun. And that's why we're possibly going to have a lockdown again. And that's going to mean more economic distress. LA is already locking down. Rhode Island's pausing, as I mentioned. Boston, New York have shut down their schools. And then, I could go on with a list of other states and cities in the country that are doing similar things. Just giving you like a sample. We have, in the whole midst of all this, we have lots of young people out of work, not able, lost their jobs, not able to get new jobs. And we have about 400 billion in unrecoverable student debt right now. That's as big as the subprime losses in 2009 or so that led to the financial crisis, the Great Recession. So here you see that a picture of unemployment, and just quickly, what we have is about 11 million people, fewer people working than back in January. We have about 11 million people less working today, and that's roughly what we had at the height of the Great Recession. So right now, times are right now as bad as they were at their worst at the Great Recession. We've got bankruptcies of large companies that have tripled this year. Bankruptcies of small companies have been delayed by the Payroll Protection Plan, which has bailed out these small companies in terms of paying for their payroll, but that could change because the Payroll Protection Plan funds have dried up, have ended, and so we could start seeing very significant bankruptcies among small business companies. Right now, the bankruptcy rate is actually lower than typical, but that again has been artificially reduced because of PPP. Bankruptcies of households have also been delayed because of forbearance on mortgages and student debt repayments. But things are changing. 12 million Americans are going to lose their unemployment benefits on December 26. State and local governments have not been bailed out. There hasn't been a new relief bill passed by Congress, so they're in very tough shape. We have California, Illinois, New York, and Michigan. People predict are going to go bankrupt, formally bankrupt. And then we've got mortgage forbearance ending in the spring. Foreclosures are going to legally begin again on January 1st. Student loan forbearance also ends January 1st. So you can have your wages garnished if you don't pay your student loans back. Your WIRMAKE, you could have 15% of your wages taken away or so each month. State and local governments may never get help, as I mentioned. If the Senate stays Republican, there may not be a deal between the Democrats and the Republicans on the bailouts. The Trump administration just told the Fed that they can't make $455 billion in loans that they had capacity to do under prior legislation. I think it was the CARES Act. So the Trump administration just said, look, you can't make those loans to all manner of small businesses and students for their loans to help refinance their loans. and to state and local government, we're just getting student loans. Was getting federal lending from the Fed. So that's kind of a glum picture in the short run. Connected to that is the fact that the people that have been studying the condition of U.S. companies tell us that 1 out of 5 U.S. companies are zombies. A zombie company doesn't have enough income to cover their debt repayments. So they live from one day to the next just by borrowing more money. And the Federal Reserve is lending to these zombies. I'm not saying that's the only type of businesses they're lending to, but certainly many of the zombies are being kept alive from day to day because of loans that are directly or indirectly coming through the Federal Reserve. And if the Fed stops lending to zombies, and the government has just taken like $500 million of their lending capacity and said you can't lend it, the Trump administration just did that, then interest rates are going to rise, and that could lead to a recession and lots of bankruptcies. So now, what are President-elect Biden, what does he have in mind for tax and Social Security reform? Well, he's going to have much higher taxes on the super rich. If you earn above $400,000, you're going to have to pay 12.4% of every dollar above that in extra FICA taxes, Social Security payroll taxes. There is a progressive Social Security benefit that he's going to be adding to benefits for people that are over 78. He's got a significant rise in the corporate income tax, which may impact negatively investment in the U.S. We'll likely have a carbon tax, but whether or not this happens, any of the stuff happens, depends on the composition and disposition of the Senate. Are they going to work with him, or are they going to view him as somehow an illegitimate president? And anyway, whether this war among the politicians is going to continue as it did under Obama and under Clinton, and also under Trump. We've had basically political warfare on both sides. Anyway, in terms of total U.S. debt accumulation, we're going to have a 136% debt to GDP, that's gross debt, by the end of this year. It was 106% in 2019, so just 1 year went up by 20% of GDP. The Biden proposals entail major increases in spending that would raise the debt to GDP ratio even further. Just to give you a comparison, the 2020 Italian ratio of debt to GDP, Italy is viewed as a very highly indebted nation. It was 155%. So the U.S. is heading very rapidly towards Italian debt levels scaled by our economy. We've got a lot more implicit debt relative to GDP than Italy. I mean, if you look at Social Security, for example, in the U.S., it's 53 trillion by itself in the red, according to the trustees report issued in April. And we've had no real Social Security reform to deal with Social Security's long-term problems. Italy's had 4 different reforms, so they've taken care of that problem. Their healthcare isn't growing so rapidly. Our healthcare continues to grow as a share of GDP. So we're actually in much worse fiscal shape than Italy, and I think most, virtually any developed country in the world. Okay, and then all this is happening against a backdrop of China doing quite well through this epidemic, and as I said, making trade deals with all our former trading partners, leaving us in the dust, so to speak. So the dollar could drop in terms of its value compared to foreign currencies. The national economy may never be the same. We may start, many more of us may do remote work. We may have much less business travel because we can meet remotely. This could lead to a howling out of the cities, which we're already seeing people exiting the cities. We'll probably have a permanent increase in personal saving because people are so scared. Just like in the Great Depression, people got very, very scared and they started being depression babies and stopped spending. They wanted to just save. And we'll see certain industries like universities and colleges probably dramatically cut back in number. And medical care will probably be delivered remotely to a large extent, since we've now been used to that, gotten used to that, and the government has changed its regulations to allow this to happen among the Medicaid population, other other groups. So that's likely to turn out to be positive, and that may make medicine cheaper and more efficient. We'll probably have much less, permanently less business travel, fewer restaurants, hotels, and we'll also again have this changed spending mentality. Now, what about our personal economies? Let me just say a couple words there, and then I'll stop for the Q&A and get your feedback, and we'll talk. I think we all should think about planning to retire later, trying to retire later, because as we've seen, our personal economies are highly uncertain. Many of us have lost our jobs, been furloughed, and many of those jobs are not coming back because the restaurant we work for, or the travel agency we work for, or the resort we work for has shut their doors, or just is not going to be able to hire back as rapidly as we'd hoped. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has a pretty good resource online, which is their handbook of occupations. You can quickly see what one occupation pays relative to another. If you wanted to be like a audiologist, you can get paid one salary, but if you're willing to do something that might not be viewed as quite so pleasant, fitting people with prosthetics, for example, that can pay probably 50% more. The occupational handbook can give you an idea. So you can just kind of look and see what's available. They have like 800 occupations listed. So if you've lost your job and want to think about some alternative career, this is the way to go, I think, in terms of first place to look. Low inflation adjusted interest rates are here for a while, but I just say for a while because, out 5 years or so, I would think that inflation could be taking off. If inflation takes off, you don't want to be in long-term bonds, whether they're treasury bonds or any kind of bond, because they're paying a nominal amount and you'll get paid back in watered down dollars. The 30-year treasury bond is probably yielding around 1.5, 1.3% these days. Maybe it's a little bit higher, maybe it's 2, but whatever it is, 30 years of getting that amount of a coupon payment, if the price of hot dogs goes up from $5 a hot dog to $5,000 a hot dog, well, that bond that you own that's paying back the 2% fixed amount of dollars every year for 30 years, it's going to become totally worthless. So you got to be very careful about long-term bonds and inflation. I'm not saying not to buy them. I'm not an investment advisor. I'm not giving you any investment advice. I'm just saying, if you're worried about inflation, I am worried about inflation. I've been worried about inflation for quite a while, and it hasn't turned out to be the case. So a lot of what I worry about doesn't turn out to be true. I'm just saying this because I'm telling you what I think, for what it's worth. And you're nice enough to come and listen, but I can't say that I'm always going to be getting this right. But I would not touch, personally, get into a long-term bond, nominal bond, unless I had a really good hedge against inflation. And that could come in the form of having a mortgage, a big mortgage, where if I lose on my bond, well, then the repayment of my mortgage, interest and principal, is going to get watered down as well. So that kind of becomes a hedge. So unless you have a good inflation hedge, I would say it's worth thinking about being careful. Remote work is going to let us move where it's cheaper. So another thing to do in this context of this situation is to move to, if you work in, maybe work in New York, or maybe work in Hartford, Connecticut, and housing's expensive, or some Westport, Connecticut, or some part of wherever, Pennsylvania, where housing is expensive, but you can move to Wisconsin or Wyoming, where it's a whole lot cheaper. You can downsize your home, maybe not in terms of space, but in terms of costs. Property taxes are lower, maybe maintenance costs are lower, insurance would be lower, cost of the house would be lower. You can pay off your mortgage maybe at the time you move, and you can telecommute and do the same job just from Wyoming. And as we know, the prices for homes in Wyoming have jumped quite a bit, but Wyoming's a big place, and probably new construction is going to come in, so people can live out in Wyoming. A lot of people would like to live in Wyoming anyway because it's so beautiful out there. What's our best investment these days? Well, here there's no question that if you can pay off your credit card loans, student loans, mortgages, these are high interest rate obligations. And so if you're paying 7% on a student loan, if you pay it off, you're in effect getting an investment return of 7%. It's no different. So you don't want to be investing in a long-term treasury bond that's yielding let's say 2%, when you can invest in paying off your student loan and get 7%. The stock market, what about that? Well, it's got still a very high price earnings ratio. It's now around 26. That ratio today, the average is 15. We've got the highest price earnings ratio today that we had since 2008. So I don't know about the stock market. This might be a good time to think about Roth converting because we might have higher future tax rates. But again, Biden doesn't have any proposal that raises middle class tax rates at the federal income tax level. But the state and local governments might need to raise taxes. It's more important than ever to maximize your lifetime Social Security benefits. Maxify Planner or our Social Security tool, which is Maximize My Social Security, they can both help you with that. You may want to pay off your mortgage by cashing out your 401k assets, since returns are relatively miserable that you can earn on your 401k, at least on a safe basis. This might be the time to cash it out, pay the taxes, and then pay off your mortgage to, again, get that return of paying off a high interest obligation. What else do we know? Well, we know that the service sector is going to be in very bad shape for at least 6 months. So, but once things turn around, there's going to be a lot of pent-up demand for tourism, restaurants, etc. So you may want to book your trips now if you really want to get out of Dodge. So that's a little bit of the upbeat. Let me now turn this over to Alex, and we'll start with some Q&A. And I went a little bit over what I had expected.